I would say no, because the environment can change willy-nilly. There's no long-term purpose. There's no long-term telos in the Darwinian scheme of things. After Darwin published the Origin, 1859, you had a number of men sympathetic to Darwin who wanted to make it compatible with teleology. I'm thinking here of men like Asa Gray. And it's pretty clear from the correspondence with Darwin that he was not having some kind of telos built into his scheme. He did not see how it would fit in the sense of the environment having some, that is, selection having some long-term goal. And in a way, Darwin's theory of evolution was an attempt to displace earlier natural, what we'd call natural theology or natural theological models that would, similar, like, for example, Richard Owen, that would allow for there to be a teleology and orientation to biodiversity. I disagree, and I'm not a paleontologist, so I'm speaking as what you'd call a neontologist. And one reason is that by the 1920s, 1930s, you had a number of very fine paleontologists, many of them European, who looked at things such as fossil corals or stratigraphy, or fossil mollusks and invertebrates in general, but also vertebrates. I'm speaking of men such as Otto Schindewolf. And what they found is that the fossil record, you have periods of explosive diversification, followed by maybe minor diversification with what they called stasis, and then you had extinction, and then you'd have another period of this. So they came to the conclusion that the fossil record is, as Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge would later say, highly punctuated in terms of these events. The interesting thing is that by the 1940s, 1950s, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, the idea came to the fore that there really is no, how would you say, evidence to the contrary, that Darwin had it right. And you had, for example, Marjorie Green. She wrote a famous essay, I think it's famous, called Two Evolutionary Theories, where she compared the empirical evidence presented by, say, Otto Schindewolf, who believed that evolution was highly punctuated, and she compared it with that of G. Gaylord Simpson, who is one of the most famous American paleontologists and, of course, a prominent follower of the modern proponent of the modern synthesis. And what she concluded was that Schindewolf was being quite true to the evidence, and that Simpson, on the other hand, was casting the fossil record through the lens of the modern synthesis. Those things that did not fit, he would give terms like quantum evolution to, which was just another fancy way of saying it's punctuated, or it's, there are these discontinuities, so to speak. And she writes in that essay that, that there is this ruling passion in the modern synthesis, which is to defer, to move from the empirical evidence, that is the study of fossils, the study of morphology, the study of genetics, and then to move into the more abstract realm of population genetics, where then one can be playing with big A's and small a's and big B's and small b's and applying various statistical finesses to get things to work. So I would say that the common textbook story of the kind that you would read, say, in National Geographic, is that you look at the fossil record, you look at the geological evidence, and everything comports fully with the Darwinian theory of evolution. that yes, there may be some quote-unquote missing links, but these are few and far between and soon to be filled in, if not currently being filled in. However, it's long been noted that there are, in the fossil record itself, that there are periods of explosive diversification. I mean, where whole new, we would say, body plans appear within a period of just a few million years, followed by a stabilization of that body plan, and then long periods of stasis, possibly extinction after that. You see this, for example, with angious flowering plants. You see this with bony fishes. You see this notably with whales, where you have more or less quote-unquote walking whales, and then in a period of a few million years, you have fully aquatic cetaceans and a radical reorganization of the body plan. You see this also in the invertebrates, where you have just this, you have some groups, for example, like the edible shrimp you might find in the grocery store that's farmed. You have that they appeared in the Permo-Triassic or the Jurassic, and their body plan has remained essentially the same ever since. They have a lot of genetic diversity, but yet in terms of their morphological features, they appear in the fossil record, and they've been with us for well over 100 million years. Well, if you look at the one diagram Darwin provided in his 1859 book, or at least in later editions of The Origin, where he doesn't have a single root, but he does have, he shows a diagram where you have types branching off, and gradually you have the appearance of genera and then families and then orders and on to what we would call phyla. The interesting thing about the fossil record is it's actually the reverse. You have your phyla appear first, where you have the major body plans, during the so-called Cambrian explosion, maybe a few of those body plans earlier. So we're speaking about a half a billion years ago or so. And then you have the appearance of classes and orders, and then families and subfamilies and so on and so forth. Yeah, well, I would say the greatest great leap forward would be the multicellularity, where you have the, assuming you had a few billion years of just unicellular life, maybe microbial algal mats, if you want to consider that multicellular or not. But I mean the appearance of metazoans, where you have organisms that they're not only in a multicellular association, but they have distinct body plans. So for example, when I mean explosion, I mean you have the appearance of mollusks, you have the appearance of the arthropods, you have the appearance of echinoderms, you have the appearance of corals, sponges, so all the even chordates. So that would be an example. So you have that leap from unicellular life, think of a bacterium, or think of a protozoan, or think of an algae, and then you have the transition to multicellular life that would form a body plan that when you would see it, you would recognize it, because those body plans, not all of them, but many of them are with us today, including ourselves. All right. Another example of a great leap forward would be the transition from, in the chordates, the transition to having a true backbone, having a cranium, what we would essentially identify with the origin of the groups that gave rise to cartilaginous and bony fishes and allied groups. That's another thing that, taking, for example, the vertebrate tree as is, we are part of that. It explains our body plan. It was formed with that great leap forward. Population genetics is the study of genetic variation in space and time in one or more lineages. It is a product of, it arose, I would say, beginning in the early 20th century. It was the idea that one could, that the focus should not be on development, that is, how, embryogenesis. The focus should be on what is called the germline. So it's a study of essentially germ cells, their genetic constitution, and how that would change over time. And there are various mathematical tools that make that rather straightforward. Now, the question as to whether population genetics poses a challenge or not to Darwinism, I am of two minds. On the one hand, population genetics is a product of the modern synthesis. And so it provides an axiomatic foundation, to use a $20 term, that is essentially to support the modern synthesis. So it was a result of weeding a number of contending hypotheses out. So in that sense, I would like to say it's a rigged game. It's going to favor the modern synthesis. The problem is that its scope, its purview, is to handle small incremental changes over time. And one of the underlying assumptions that was there from the very start is that there's enough genetic variation in a population that selection can come in and essentially craft the population or move the population in a certain direction in combination with genetic drift. The problem is two things. Number one, the question of the origin of the fittest, the arrival of the fittest, as opposed to the survival of the fittest, has long been relegated to the side, is kind of put to the margins of population genetics. The other thing that's been put to the margins has been very rapid transitions. How does one account for, say, a dramatic leap forward in a lineage? That is a change in body plan that's dramatic when you're dealing with long-lived organisms that have small population sizes and where those changes required, at least on the surface, a number of genetic changes. That's when the model, again, it falls out of the purview of of population genetics. Well evolution was deemed in 2001 the poster child of macroevolution. That is because beginning around that time, a number of more or less complete fossil whales had been discovered, allowing for in other words, for the discovery of so-called missing links, going from a full four-legged walking hippopotamus or some other ancestor to a fully aquatic, what we would regard as more or less looking like a modern whale to appear. And so, given the anatomical, given the paleontological evidence, by 2001 it was considered the best case scenario for Darwin. So all modern whales, porpoises, dolphins, and their ancestors are thought to stem from a creature that was four-legged, superficially looked like a greyhound or a wolf. It may have been amphibious, but it certainly had all the features of a terrestrial mammal. A cartoon version of whale evolution would be you start from a four-legged ancestor that's fully terrestrial, has offspring that begin, say, hunting along margins of a seashore. Their offspring become more amphibious. You have loss of the hind limbs. You have the transformation of the forelimbs into flippers. You have the emergence of a tail fluke. You have and their offspring in turn, as this is taking place, are becoming ever more torpedo-shaped, until finally you have a more or less modern whale that's completing its life cycle in a fully marine environment. Well, if you start from a creature like I just mentioned, superficially looks like, in my opinion, a greyhound or a wolf, and to the first fully aquatic whale, 9 to 11 million years. The interesting thing is that for most of that period, filling in the gaps between a four-legged, superficially, wolf-like ancestor to on the other side, a fully aquatic whale, you had a number of so-called walking whales or proto-whales. We have a number of more or less fully intact skeletons of those, or their fossilized remains, I should say. And it's clear that the attributes that separate the fully aquatic cetaceans from their walking whale ancestors appeared very abruptly in the fossil record. My estimate is within a few million years, because you go from a type, I'll give you a name, Georgiacetus, which shows reduction of the hind limbs, but no tail flukes. It has some aspects of the fully aquatic fossil whales, but not all of them. And then you come to a period of a creature like Dorodon or Basilosaurus, which was originally thought to be a sea serpent, by the way, where you have, it is distinct from modern whales, but it was fully aquatic, and it had tail flukes. It had reduced hind limbs, but at the same time, it had many of the features that would characterize modern whales too. First of all, that is an open question. It's an open question because there have been no empirical studies, there have been no mathematical studies to actually grapple with the number of changes that have been that took place. So that's one thing. Second is that you have to narrow that down because, again, we're talking about something that's akin to punctuated equilibrium. You have a period where you have a number of these so-called walking whales, but they lack many, if not most, of the attributes that would separate the earliest fossil fully seagoing or seafaring whales and modern whales from the rest. And that appears very abruptly in the fossil record. So the question is there enough time? It depends on, you have to take into account a number of factors. One is that we're talking about organisms that have long generation times. On average, we'll say 5 years. So they're not like bacteria, viruses, or fruit flies or anything like that. Second is that mammals, in general, do not have large reproductive population sizes. So we're not talking about millions of individuals. We're talking about some, populations that may have numbered in the thousands or 10,000s or perhaps more. So those put a number of constraints on the number of genetic changes that could have accrued over time. The third issue is that when you look at the characters that had to be transformed, in a window of, say, 5 million years or less. And you begin doing calculations, just working within the parameters of population genetics. And this is something that I've been doing with some colleagues. What one finds is that once you get beyond, say, 5 or 6 or 7 changes that had to occur more or less, not necessarily simultaneously, but changes that had to build to an adaptation, it becomes prohibitive. There simply was not enough time for that to occur. Well, I guess the best analogy would be, imagine if you were going to take your Volkswagen and decide you were going to visit the Marianas Trench in it. Or let's say you're going to have a submersible that could go down a few thousand feet. Well, how many engineering changes would you have to make to your vehicle to accomplish that? Well, it's similar, going from a four-legged, fully terrestrial mammal to an organism that can complete its life cycle out at sea, give birth there, suckle the young, dive down 1,000 feet or so, hunt fishes, etc. It requires a number of extensive changes. Changes to the eyes, changes to hearing, changes to the reproductive system, modification of the body so that instead of walking on 4 limbs, the body adopts a torpedo shape, more or less, that has hydrodynamic properties. It can move very swiftly to hunt prey under the water. So you're talking about changes to the musculature. You're talking about changes to the vertebral column, the origin of a tail fluke, and all of the musculature and also neurological systems for coordinating that. Changes of breathing, which is very important. You have to be able to control breathing in such a way that when diving, there's the blowhole or the nostrils remain closed, and then there can be the exchange of the exhalation and inhalation once the surface. Then there's the question of sleep. You've got to be able to sleep at sea. Mammals sleep, and you've got to do that while underwater. Or at least for most of the body being underwater. So when one looks at the changes, when one looks at and many of these changes occur very early in the embryology of dolphins and whales. So all these things have to be rooted back to development. And what you can see is that the characteristics of the features that enable one to say, yes, that's a dolphin, that's a whale, no, that's a four-legged terrestrial mammal, occur early. And so these are changes that would have to be incorporated into the body plan very early on. Years ago, David Berlinski came up with a back-of-the-envelope calculation on the number of characters that would have had to have been transformed going from a walking whale to a fully aquatic whale. And his ballpark estimate was 50,000 characters that had to change. I was motivated to look into it, and depending on how detailed one wants to be, I think David Berlinski is far more right than he is wrong. I think the number of changes, the morphological details that separates a walking whale from a fully aquatic whale, particularly our modern whale in certainty, is anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000, if not more. I would err on the side of David Berlinski's estimate as opposed to those who think, well, all you'd have to do is shave a cow, cut off its legs, throw it in the water, and it would be able to, perform the task of a whale. That is, only a few changes would have been required. In 2006, Hans Twissen and some other group looked at hind limb reduction in the so-called walking whales, because one signature of the fully aquatic whales is that they have extremely reduced hind limbs. The hind limbs are present, but they're within the body. So there were external remnants of them, but nevertheless, they would not have been able to move around on land successfully. So what was proposed was a microevolutionary model of hind limb reduction. And that's one where you have a number of genetic changes, nothing dramatic, but accreting in this walking whale population or proto-whale population, and then you end up with the fully aquatic version of that. Now, what I have looked at is the number of genetic networks that would have had to have transformed. How many would have been involved with the hind limb? How many would have been involved with the reproductive system? Because you have to recall that with the reduction of hind limbs that you see in cetacean, you also have dramatic changes to the pelvic region. You have the loss of that. It's detachment from the vertebral column. And this affects reproduction because the reproductive organs have to be attached to the pelvic region, et cetera, in terrestrial mammals, by and large, in order for things such as copulation. So when you're talking about whales, you're talking about a completely different picture for how that can occur. So things like the reproductive genetic network had to change, the musculature network had to change, the hind limb hind limb bone development system had to change, the neurological system had to change. So the number of genetic transitions that had to occur, depending on how micro you want micro to be, is anywhere from I would say, many tens to hundreds. Now, that is of genetic changes that would have had to have accreted in the population over time. When you construct a realistic model, taking into account on average 5 years generation time, on average, say, a breeding population size of 10,000 to 100,000 individuals, which is, I think, a reasonable estimate for a proto-whale population, you find that anywhere between 5 to 10 genetic changes is pushing the limits of the time available. When you start talking about 20 genetic changes, and I don't mean just average genetic changes. I mean those that would have made a difference in that transition, say in the reduction of the hind limbs or in the repositioning of the reproductive organs. If you go beyond 10, 15 genetic changes as being a requisite for that, then there was no time available. Well, it depends upon the estimates that you use, but if, for example, you want to think of one morphological innovation, let's say the origin of tail fluke, which involves, it's just more than having an extension of the tail. It involves a modification, it involves the origin of a unique part of the backbone called the ball vertebra, which enables the tail to move up and down. It involves a modification of the musculature. It involves a modification of the neurological control of that musculature. And so we're talking about a number of changes, but if you imagine, say, that 2 genes are involved, according to some estimates, that's, and these are not my own estimates, but these follow from a paper published about a decade ago or so back. That would take about 43 million years for those 2 changes, 2 genes to come together in such a way that would enable, say, a tail fluke to have emerged. Well, there just was not enough time. It's a numbers problem. The analogy I like to use is imagine someone goes from, say, poverty to being a billionaire overnight. Well, that raises the question, how did that happen? Were they pinching pennies? Were they a wise investor? Did some wealthy relative pass on their estate? What exactly happened? So when you look at whale evolution from the same perspective, and you start saying, well, let's assume that we're talking about hundreds of morphological changes here. And let's assume, simplistically, mind you, that it's just one or two genes underpinning each morphological change, maybe even more, depending on how micro you want those transitions to be. It becomes very quickly prohibitive. There just was not enough time. So taking other estimates, and this I've done in collaboration with others, if you required, say, 5 genes to change, or more, say up to 10 genes to change, to have the emergence of a tail fluke, or to have the emergence of, say, or not emergence, but say a fully reduced hind limbs, like you would see in the modern whales, then the 3-4 million years, even 9 to 11 million years, given population size estimates, given generation time estimates, there was not enough time to accomplish that. So that means that we have to look at other models for how that transition occurred, models that have largely been ignored by advocates of the modern synthesis. One favored hypothesis that has come to the fore, not by myself and by others, others that would be, say, in the intelligent design community, but those that work with fossil cetaceans, is that essentially is that of the hopeful monster, that maybe there were 1 or 2 genetic changes that radically transformed a number of organ systems all at once. The problem with that is when you look at the genes that are involved in, say, the hind limb development, that we know play a critical role in dolphin embryogenesis. Those genes have multiple effects on, for example, they have effects on heart development, they have effects on brain development, so they just don't affect one, just the hind limbs, the femur and things like that, the pelvis. So when you have a mutation, and we know this from studies in, say, mice, when you have a mutation, yes, indeed, you may get a reduction of hind limbs, but you also may have a number of significant birth defects that effectively make that mutation null and void in terms of its reproductive advantage. Yeah, so it's an arrival of the fittest problem as opposed to a survival of the fittest problem. So it's a question of if a particular trait needs 2 or more mutations, not to appear simultaneously, so we're not talking about what's the probability of that, but just for 2 changes to coalesce, come together in an individual such that an adaptive trait appears. How much time would that take? Well, you have to, again, factor in, how long the generations are, what is the average population size that's breeding, contributing to the next generation on average. And then look at, well, what percentage of the mutations would not necessarily be neutral, but would actually be advantageous. And what one finds is that that's a problem that has been largely ignored until Michael Behe put it front and center in the mid-2000s. And then it began to be, it had been investigated. I mean, people had looked into it before, sure. But you started having advances on the mathematical front by investigators such as Durrett and Schmidt, who started looking at things like human evolution. How many, for example, how long would be the waiting time for 2 mutations to come together, 2 novel changes that would give an adaptive trait. And they found that in the case of, say, hominids, that would include myself and would include also our ancestors, that would have been 216 million years. That's the waiting times that it would have taken for those 2 changes to have come together in such a way that you would get some novel trait to appear. And remember, estimates of, say, human-chimpanzee divergence is anywhere from 5.5 million to 6 million years. So 216 million, if you have to wait that long and you look at the fossil record, there's a problem there. That is the waiting times problem. And you can apply it also to the whale evolution problem. What is the waiting time, say, for those 20 genetic changes to have occurred that contributed to hind limb reduction or the emergence of a tail fluke? How many million years are we talking about here? So you have to think of it in terms of, it's again a numbers game. You have to think of it in terms of the resources available, changes that would have occurred, and what are the time constraints on those changes. So why is generation time a problem for whale evolution? Well, unlike viruses that can, not only are there large numbers of them, but they can mutate rapidly, and so the turnover is as we know, very rapid. In the case of bacteria, for example, under ideal conditions, their generation time can be, half an hour. For fruit flies, it can be 8 days. So what does this mean? It means that genetic changes can occur very rapidly because the turnover of the populations are taking place very rapidly. So you can see things like insecticide resistance appear very quickly and spread to a population very rapidly. That's not a problem. When you come to something like mammals, when you come to whales, you're talking about generation times of, say, 5 years. So suddenly the turnover, that is where you have individuals reproducing, the young growing to maturity, in turn reproducing, suddenly the turnover, the genetic turnover time becomes much, much, much longer. And so the textbook models that one would take from viruses or bacteria or fruit flies and extrapolate over to whales no longer, it applies, but it becomes orders of magnitude longer. So that's one of the aspects of the waiting time problem. The breeding population size is a problem for whale evolution for actually two reasons. One is that mammals in general have breeding population sizes that are on the order of, take the Norwegian rat, say around 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 5th even. And so they're really not that large. There are a lot of Norwegian rats living in a lot of cities, but in terms of the actual breeding population size, on average at any given time, it falls far less than 10 to the 9th individuals. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, it has been, when you look at the equations of population genetics, natural selection really doesn't have traction on populations that fall below that 10 to the 9th number, breeding population size on average. And so mammals, birds, some flowering plants, they fall down into a range at which to invoke natural selection to explain changes occurring over time, the equations really don't have, selection really doesn't have traction there. Now, that's one aspect of it. So if you want to invoke selection and you say, but the population sizes we're talking about are on the average of 10,000, 100,000 individuals, the selection option no longer applies, which brings the second problem. What then begins to apply is what is called a drift model, which means that under a genetic drift model, a trait, be it a good trait or be it a bad trait, has a 50-50 chance of getting fixed in a population over time. So, and according to some estimates, in mammalian populations, including our own, the evolution that has occurred has largely been due to genetic drift. It's not been due to selection if you will, forcing the population down a certain trajectory. This is the technical term for it is a near neutral model, which means the population can go in a number of directions willy-nilly. So that's the breeding population size aspect of the waiting times problem. The problem is that what we see in whale evolution is we see directionality. We see a number of coordinated changes that occurred very rapidly. And so to explain that on the basis of just genetic drift, that random changes just happened to come together and appear to be directed, that does not seem to comport at all with what we see. Which is why natural selection was invoked for since 1859 to account for such directionality. When you say, well, natural selection no longer really applies, things just happen, and then you see the directionality of going from a walking whale to a fully aquatic whale, the two don't add up. It does not seem to comport. I know of no neutral model that can explain the kind of directionality you see in whale evolution. When you look at these punctuated events in the fossil record, where all of a sudden you have the appearance of, say, the metazoan body plants, multicellular body plant, arthropods, mollusks, corals, and the like, you have on the one side the argument that there are no such explosions. That yes, indeed, we look at the fossil record, yes, indeed, it appears to be abrupt, but not really. There were ghost lineages. We just don't have records of them. But actually, these changes occurred gradually. They occurred according to the standard modern synthesis view of just a number of very small genetic changes accreting over or accreting in space and time in a lineage. And therefore, there's nothing to see here. Move along, just move along. Then you have another argument, which was one that stemmed from the 1920s, 1930s, largely in Europe, of just taking the fossil record, looking at it and saying, well, no, actually, there are these explosive events. We do see arthropods suddenly appearing. And not only do we see arthropods suddenly appearing, but we see a number of really weird arthropods appearing, like Anomalocaris and the like. And so the argument there is that, well, whatever changes occurred genetically had to have occurred very rapidly, and they had to have occurred also in a coordinated way. And the most extreme, which would be the opposite of the microevolutionary view, was that proposed by Richard Goldschmidt in 1940, and that was the notion of the hopeful monster, summarized aptly as the first bird hatched from a lizard's egg. And so his argument was that you had you could have one or two mutations that would occur, and these were called systemic mutations, and they would change the whole body plan. So that's the exact opposite. So looking at the fossil record, and he was taking the evidence that had been amassed by Otto Schindewolf and others, and he said, well, actually, there are these abrupt transitions, and maybe one or two genetic changes could account for them. The problem with that view, as was noted, was that you still have to explain it in terms of a population genetic account. So you may have that one-off individual, you may have a lizard population, and suddenly you have a bird appear, but who would that bird mate with? If all of his kin, his brothers and sisters, are lizards, in other words. So you don't evade the population problem. Other models that have been proposed are those of a more Lamarckian nature, which is that, yes, indeed, you do get these punctuated events. There are these explosive events in the fossil record. What you see with the Cambrian explosion is real. What you see with the origin of, say, bony fishes and angiosperms and others, all these, the origin of insect flight, yes, these were dramatic events, but they could be explained because of some internal directedness to mutational changes. So it's not just population genetics. There's an oriented, I wouldn't say teleological, but there's this oriented factor to evolution. And the problem there is that there really are no mechanisms to account for that. We have, to this day, no evidence for there being any real, quote-unquote, Lamarckian transformations. A model that I have favored, that I have written about and that I have colleagues have written about, is that there are so-called jumping genes. Most of our DNA, for example, in the case of mammals, over half of it consists of things that are like these viral-like elements and various other transposons or so-called jumping genes. We know on the one hand that that they're replete with genetic modules that can affect gene regulation. We know that they can move around quite rapidly, within and between chromosomes. And we do know that they can affect genetic changes rather rapidly. And so you have this idea, and I would say the most eloquent exponent of it would be James Shapiro, that there is this, can be a deployment of genetic information that is not at all random. It's not necessarily intelligently designed, but nevertheless, it can allow for rapid genetic changes to occur in a non-random manner. The problem I would see with that model, even though I am inclined to it, is that it has to be mapped to with what we know in the fossil record. And I am not yet convinced that the fossil record can be mapped fully onto such a model of non-random evolution. And so, I forgot the number, but I would say one of the other contenders for a punctuated equilibrium type picture, which is where you're taking the fossil record as given, saying, yes, indeed, there are these, I wouldn't call them discontinuities, but certainly the abrupt appearance of new body plans. And that is put under the term self-organization, that multicellularity, that is having a multicellular organism, is rather easy to attain, that the genetic changes do not need to be large or numerous, and then quote-unquote self-organization takes over the rest. This is there are some proponents of this, and by the way, I'm not doing their model any justice, but the problem is that term self-organization is a very woolly term. In fact, I know of only one or two very good definitions of self-organization that appeared in the 1950s, and all of them said that the term is basically, as used, largely devoid of content. And there are various mathematical reasons for it. So I would say that where I have come to agree with Stephen Meyer is that when you look at the existing models that have been proposed, even models that I've long favored, and still I'm inclined to favor them, they fall short of providing an adequate explanation for what we actually see in the fossil record. And that is the reason why I would say alternatives such as intelligent design cannot be simply pushed to the side, because we do not have a model that rules out all of the other contenders. It seems to me that that kind of directionality ultimately collapses to a model that's either panpsychist, if that term, where matter and mind are basically one and the same thing, or whether beginning with the Big Bang, there were some predestination. There was a pre-ordering of things, but at a very fundamental level, at a quantum level, or at an elemental level, because ultimately it would mean that by the time you get bacteria, protozoa, you have these programmed genetic changes. You have mechanisms in place that can diversify and that can be deployed to become everything that we see in the natural world. And in the, not only today, but preceding that. So if you're not going to allow for an extrinsic source of information, the alternative is it has to be intrinsic. And if you want to stick to some version of materialism or naturalism to account for that predestination or preordination of events, I don't see how you can do that. I don't see how one can have programmed genetic changes without there being some pre-programmer. Unless one wants to go down, say, a vitalistic route, which most don't, or down a panpsychist route, which after Teilhard de Chardin, most don't, or some so-called emergentist materialism account, which I think is devoid of content. Well, I'm a Platonist. So my view is that there is an extrinsic source of information. I'm not a monist in any sense. That does not mean that I negate there having been some kind of evolution, a phylogeny, etc. But I believe that the patterns that we see in space and time, while they occur in space and time, ultimately have their source in an informational realm that is outside space and time. If you were to press me and say, well, what's your source for this? Are you hearkening to the book of Genesis? I would say no, but I am hearkening to the Timaeus. And that doesn't mean I believe in a demiurge or anything necessarily, but it does mean that I adopt a Platonic view, and I agree with Lloyd Garrison that Aristotle was also a Platonist. So a Platonic Aristotelian view of the natural world, which I think is a full-blooded view of the natural world. It takes each species, as being what it is, something that has a paradigm, has a model, that a verity of its own. And yes, species go extinct, yes, species appear, but it takes the notion of, say, programmed genetic changes and say, well, indeed, if they occurred, then there was a pre-programmed source for that information. But this is not something we're going to find by just looking at the material elements or by looking at the periodic table or something like that. It's something that we're going to have to find in an extrinsic source, and that extrinsic source is the basis of the rational structure of the universe. So there is an intelligibility to the natural world. Otherwise, science would not be possible. And so when I look at that tree, for example, or the bird flying by, it's not just something that's willy-nilly. It's not just something that just happened. It's something that reveals an underlying template to the universe. And it has to be taken for what it is. But it's of intrinsic value, each and every species. So that, I would say, is my view of looking at things.